Hi, for reasons I don't really need to explain, unfortunately, Denmark has been in the news a lot, and I thought it was high time I did a deep dive into the Danish military and Danish defense policy. These are things that I suspect a few of us really know anything about. This threatens to be a long video because I have a lot to say, so what I've done is I put timestamps into the description below it, also into the pinned comment. So here's what I'm going to talk about. Part 1, Denmark's strategic position. Geography is everything. This is where we're going to look at a map and think about what the map tells us. Part 2, Danish military policy, both pre and post World War II, during the Cold War and after. Like Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands, all countries I've done videos about, and I put links below in the description. The Danes discovered in World War II that neutrality really was not a very helpful thing, and they had a miserable time under German occupation in the 1940s. The obvious answer for them was to embrace the Pax Americana. The Pax Americana, remember that? We'll talk about that. So part 3, Afghanistan and Iraq. This really should be a subsection of the previous part 2, but I want to pay particular attention to this because I don't think many of us, particularly many of you Americans, those of you who are Americans, really have any idea what the Danes and the Danes did in Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, finally, we're going to do an overview of the Danish military, part 4, its budget, its branches. Does it all make sense? Finally, part 5, the elephant in the room. Greenland. My name is Michael Shirk, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. As usual, if you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. You know the drill, but also if you feel so inspired, feel free to put some cash in my tip jar using the thanks button, or you can buy me a coffee using the link in the description below. You can even become a member to support the channel, which will make you one of the coolest people on earth. Part 1. Denmark's strategic position. Now let's just look at this map and contemplate it. All right, what do you see? Denmark, as any diplomacy player can tell you, occupies an extremely valuable bit of land. It's sort of a bridge connecting Germany and Sweden. And there are bridges, by the way, so you can physically do this. But most importantly, Denmark is a gateway between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. It is the gate, and it makes all the sense in the world. Among other things, that the Danes and the Swedes fought each other at least a dozen times, right, over the centuries. I have to confess that I didn't actually know anything about this, that the fact that the Danes and the Swedes fought all these wars, until I went to the Danish War Museum in Copenhagen. It's amazing. If you happen to be in Copenhagen, I hope you do get a chance to go because it's wonderful. But please go to the Danish War Museum. You'll learn a lot. Very, very informative. Anyway, Denmark also fought Germany a few times, or maybe I should say the German states. The most notable examples of these wars are the two Schleswig wars of the mid-19th century, the second being against Prussia and Austria. Denmark lost. And of course, there's the German invasion and the occupation from 1940, 1945. And once the Germans seized Denmark, by the way, this meant that the Allies could no longer access the Baltic Sea. This is really important. If you hold Denmark, you get to control who gets in and out of the Baltic. Denmark also fought England a few times, specifically during the Napoleonic Wars. These were mostly naval actions, and the Royal Navy bombarded Copenhagen in 1807. Now, in today's world, again, just looking at this map, what this means is that Denmark is actually extremely valuable. Most countries bordering the Baltic Sea now are NATO, but Russia still has a coastline there, plus there's a Kaliningrad enclave. And in a war, NATO allies want to use the sea lines of communication to get supplies into the Baltic region and or attack Russia. Having control over Denmark, therefore, is critical. If you're the Russian Navy, you really want to be able to get past Denmark or keep Allied vessels from passing through Denmark, right? And then, of course, there are two Danish possessions that happen to be strategically located. Greenland, which you might have heard about recently, and the Faroe Islands, which are there, right? Why are they important? Well, because they're valuable for controlling the North Atlantic and the so-called GI-UK gap. Part 2, Danish military policy. Danish military history is actually far more interesting than I would have imagined for a little country. I didn't really have any notion of any of this until I went to the Danish War Museum. I didn't know, for example, that Denmark used to dominate Sweden and Norway and was a leading Baltic power for a while. Now, I'd argue that up through to the 18th century, Danish military policy was mostly about its rivalry with its Scandinavian neighbors and trying to keep a balanced power with regional players like Russia. It evolved towards something like an armed neutrality, and which involved having a standing army and a territorial defense and a competent navy capable of escorting neutral shipping and controlling the straits. I'm oversimplifying, of course, but I don't want this video to be 2 hours long. In the 19th century, the consolidation of the German states made Germany, or the Germanies, more and more of a problem for Denmark. And I'd argue that fighting Germans was a greater challenge to Denmark than fighting its Scandinavian neighbors, because Denmark is a naval power. The German states were land powers. Tiny Denmark has a more difficult time sustaining large land forces than it has sustaining adequate naval forces. At least that's my hypothesis. Staines, if you disagree, please don't kill me in the comments and set me straight. I'd really welcome the correction. Denmark managed to stay out of World War I by declaring itself to be strictly neutral. It also was very well armed at the time, which helps maintaining a neutrality. It did, however, favor Germany, primarily because it feared Germany more than it feared Britain. Now, remember, Prussia and Austria defeated Denmark in 1864. And as I said, my theory is that little Denmark is simply better at handling naval threats like the one that the British represented than the land threat that the Germans represented. So Denmark focused on not provoking the Germans, which among many things meant keeping the Brits from slipping through Denmark to get at Germany on the Baltic side, or to be able to resupply Russia. How did Denmark do this? It mined the straits and it patrolled them. And from what I read, only a few British submarines were able to get through Denmark. So no Allied shipping into the Baltic Sea during World War I. Post-World War I, Denmark, like Norway and Sweden and the Netherlands and Belgium, kept betting on armed neutrality. But here's the thing. During World War I, when Denmark declared its neutrality, it did, in fact, have fairly decent military. It spent a lot of money on its military. But after World War I, the Danish government decided to disarm. One argument was that, you don't really need a military because we've got the League of Nations, everything's great. The war to end all wars, no more wars. Awesome. Another thing is that there was an argument that the best way to prevent the Germans from attacking you is by demonstrating your weakness to the Germans, by making sure that the Germans understand that you don't pose any kind of threat whatsoever. So be as harmless as possible. You don't need to attack us because we are harmless. The other argument, which I find more compelling, is, well, why bother? If you know that you could never defend yourself against the Germans, why bother even trying? Like, why spend money on a military that the Germans are just going to be able to steamroller over anyways, right? So in retrospect, these are terrible ideas, because Denmark's nearly complete lack of military power in 1940, instead of communicating to Nazi Germany that it should be left alone because it was harmless, convinced the Nazis that Denmark was a low-hanging fruit ripe for the plucking. And I guess they probably also reckoned better repluck it than the British. That's precisely what the Germans did. There's a lesson to be learned here, I think, which is, among other things, don't be anybody's low-hanging fruit. I'm going to add to this that in World War II, the Danes quickly lost control of their two important overseas possessions, Greenland and the Faroe Islands. In the case of Greenland, what happened, I believe, is that a Danish minister, more or less on his own initiative, signed an agreement with the United States, whereby the United States would occupy Greenland while respecting Danish sovereignty. This was 1941. This marks the start of an uninterrupted United States military presence in Greenland, which continues to this day. As for the Faroes, the UK grabbed them after the fall of Denmark and occupied them throughout the war, handing them over once the war was done. Post-war, the Danes, like the Belgians, like the Netherlands, like Norway, renounced armed neutrality. Their first choice was, immediately after the war, was to try to create some sort of Scandinavian collective defense union. That apparently didn't work out. And then as the Cold War began to emerge, the Danes threw in with the Pax Americana, reckoning that collective defense under the American security umbrella was the way to go. So Denmark became a founding member of NATO 1949, and committed itself to spending money to build up its forces, and among other things, to spend a large amount of money on American military equipment. The Danes did ask the Americans to stop occupying Greenland, but that evolved into the 1951, I believe, defense agreement, by which the U.S. maintained bases there and could move troops around Greenland and do more or less whatever it wanted militarily, while respecting Danish sovereignty and while not interfering in the affairs of the Danish government and the Greenland government. Let me repeat that. The deal signed in 1951 that more or less remains in place is that the U.S. military can do whatever it wants in Greenland, provided it recognizes that Greenland is part of the Danish kingdom and doesn't interfere in Denmark and Greenland's self-government and administration. I believe the only one restriction that the Danes put on what the U.S. could do in in Greenland was they didn't want there to be nuclear weapons base in Greenland, although from what I understand, the Americans kind of cheated and the Danes didn't really look very hard. There's almost a don't ask, don't tell approach to it. The Americans did have nuclear weapons and the Danes just, we don't know, we don't see. It only became a problem when the B-52, I believe, in 1968 crashed, and they're like, oh, guess what it's carrying? This is kind of a problem. But that was really it. That's really it. During the Cold War, the Danes focused on territorial defense and keeping the Warsaw Pact out of northern Germany. And all of this induced Denmark to have a relatively large military supported by conscription. So the geographic focus makes sense to me. Let's put it this way. If you think about it, the single greatest contribution Denmark can make to collective defense, the NATO's defense, is controlling the Danish Straits, i.e. the gateway between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. If that's all Denmark did, that would already be a huge thing. Anything else would be icing on the cake. Also, there's something I read about in the Danish War Museum. The post-war Danish government was worried about communism at home. It calculated that the best way to snuff out domestic political radicalism and preempt homegrown communism was by investing in a robust welfare state. That's something a lot of Western European countries did. At least that's what I recall reading in the Danish War Museum. Danes, please, if I got that wrong, please weigh in. So they spent a lot of money. They could have spent more, but they decided not to do too much because they also wanted to spend money on the welfare state, ultimately thinking that this is how we keep within the West and liberal democracy rather than having political radicalism. How much did the Danes spend on defense? As far as I could tell, the Danes in the 1930s spent between 1.2% of GDP on defense, which is not a lot. In fact, generally until in the 30s, I would say closer to 1% than 2%. So like a little over 1% GDP. Until 1939, 1940, when Denmark belatedly doubled its defense budget. Post-war spending started climbing. In 1950, it was about 1.7%. In 1953, it was 3.7%. Throughout the 1960s, it was about 3% of GDP, but it began drifting a little bit down at the end of the decade to 2.3% of GDP. And in the 70s, it was between 2.0 and 2.5%. In the 80s, it was more like 2%. Now remember, the GDP grew a lot in these decades. So in absolute terms, Denmark was spending more money. 2% of GDP in 1985, Denmark was a lot more money than 2% of GDP in 1955. Now, in the 1980s, that kind of money translated into a military that had about 30,000 active duty soldiers and a wartime mobilized force of a bit over 100,000. That does sound to many of us like a small number, but remember in the 1980s, Denmark's population was only about 5 million people. It's not a lot of people. So I would say, relatively speaking, proportionately speaking, this is a pretty large military. Then the Cold War ended, and like everybody else, the Danes reduced their spending. So what happened? In the 1990s, Danish spending fell below 2%, but generally stayed above 1.5%. In the 2000s, it fell below 1.5%. The overall size of the military dropped to maybe 20 to 22,000 active duty, though a larger proportion of that force was deployable and expeditionary than had been true in the Cold War. This is what everybody's thinking, and the Danes are not alone in this. You no longer need to worry about territorial defense because the Warsaw Pact is not going to invade you. In fact, nobody's going to invade you. In 2000, who's going to invade Denmark? You don't have to worry about this. So what you do need to do is, in order to keep contributing to the collective defense, what you do is you need expeditionary forces You need to professionalize your military, have expeditionary forces that you can go and send out on multinational operations under a NATO or under a UN flag. So they abandoned territorial defense and they created this sort of a force more geared towards the smaller expeditionary stuff. And they deployed. They went to the Balkans. They also went to Afghanistan and Iraq. By the way, the Danes never actually got rid of conscription, but they reduced the numbers of the people that the system actually inducted. Part 3. The Danish military in Afghanistan and Iraq. Let's do Afghanistan first. Danish troops first deployed in Afghanistan in 2002, and they stayed until 2021. More than 18,000 Danish troops served in Afghanistan in total. In the high-intensity ISAF years, the NATO years, which ran from 2006. 2006 is that's when Afghanistan really became a hot war. To about 2014, Denmark usually had in the country on the order of 600 to 800 troops at any given time, mostly in Helmand province. So, for example, in 2010, there were about 760 Danish soldiers in Afghanistan. Helmand province, if you don't know, was one of the hottest zones of the war in those years. I mean, this was a full-blown war. It is not a peacekeeping operation. And the Danes served under British command as part of the UK-led Task Force Helmand. When you look into the history of a lot of the European and other contingents that served in Afghanistan, there is this problem where when they first got involved, it was generally sold as kind of like a peacekeeping operation. So go to Afghanistan, it'll be easy, it'll be fine, it'll be like, a lot of the things that NATO forces were doing in the Balkans at the time. But then 2006 suddenly find themselves in a hot war, and it was interesting to see how the different countries adapted to this situation. So the Dutch, the Danes, the Germans, the French, I mean, everybody was like, oh my God, there's fighting a war. Now what do we do? And so they had to re-gear. They weren't expecting to be doing this kind of fight, but that's what they did. And the Canadians adapted and they fought. And the Danes also adapted and then they fought. And the Dutch as well. The Germans had some issues because of their own kind of issues, but they more or less did it. But, I mean, one thing I want to stress, though, is throughout all of this, as these countries in 2006 are finding themselves in the midst of a full-blown war, is that there were some coalition partners that really didn't do a lot of fighting and didn't want to do a lot of fighting, and they operated within what they called caveats, national caveats. Like, we'll do this, but we're not going to do that, or we'll use these kinds of forces, but we don't want to bring in heavy weapons because, I don't know, politically it's a problem. And the joke at the time was that ISAF stood for I Saw Americans Fight. The Danes, however, were among those who did not operate with caveats. As far as I know, they were in the thick of some of the most intense fighting of the war. By all accounts, they fought like lions. 43 Danish soldiers died, which is the highest ratio of any of the coalition partners. And if you want to get a taste of what the Danes did, by the way, there's some really good footage, combat footage, videos on YouTube that you could look up. And there are also several movies. There's a movie called A War from 2015. It's a fictional war about a Danish company commander in Helmand and his men's combat tour. I've not seen it, but I'd like to. There's Armadillo 2010, which is a documentary that follows Danish soldiers. There's a film called Walk With Me, which from 2016 about a young Danish soldier who's badly wounded in Helmand. And then there's a film called Brothers in 2004, which super interesting. I'm sure there are also books about the Danes in Afghanistan. I don't frankly know anything about those books. I did read a good book about the British in Helmand in 2006. And it often mentions the Danes. It's called 3 Para. Put a link in the description. If I recall correctly, the book relates a particularly intense battle during which the Taliban tried to overthrow a British Army outpost. The book had particular praise for a certain female Danish soldier who apparently was a cold-blooded killer with her machine gun, and she helped save the outpost while also providing medical care to a lot of the guys in the outpost. I wanted to look up the book, but unfortunately it's somewhere in my basement. I couldn't find it. But I poked around on the internet and I found out who she was. Her name is Sophia Brun. Here's a picture of her. By the way, she was killed in 2010 in an IED strike on her armored vehicle. She was the first Danish female soldier to die in combat. She was 22 years old. Now, as for Iraq, the Danes deployed soldiers in 2003-2007, usually about 450 to 500 at any given time. Like in Afghanistan, the Danes served under British command, and like in Afghanistan, they did frontline duty, often getting into firefights and ambushes, etc. 7 Danes died in Iraq. Part 4, finally, Danish military overview. So here we are in 2026. We've got 12 years after Russia grabbed Crimea, 4 years after Russia's second invasion. Plus, we now have Trump haranguing Europe about defense spending, and worst of all, threatening Denmark over Greenland. Where are the Danes? What's with the Danish military today? Beginning in 2014, I remember I'd said that after the Cold War, Denmark switched gears towards, like, away from territorial defense and towards having this expeditionary deployable force for going abroad to do NATO stuff. Far away, out of area operations. This, after 2014, began to appear less and less like a good idea, and Denmark tacked back to territorial defense and focusing on the Baltic and the Arctic. This meant progressively increasing spending, growing the force, and reorganizing and re-equipping it. One goal, for example, is to be able to generate and sustain a 4,000, I've also read 6,000 man medium-heavy brigade, kitted out for serious conventional warfare to be able to plug and play in some sort of NATO coalition operation somewhere in Europe. They're now at about 3% GDP spending, and they've also started adding women into the conscription pool and extending the length of time that conscripts serve. The force does remain small. Its active force is about 21,000. The reserve is 12,000, and the Homeguard is, well, I've seen the numbers vary from the 40,000s to the low 50,000s for the Homeguard. We'll talk about them in a bit. Let's go branch by branch, starting with the Army. It's what we're dealing with the Danish Army is that it's a small but high-end force. So it's like the Norwegians, the Swedes. They've got a lot of money, so they're very well equipped. So it's small, but the idea is that this is a high-end, heavy to medium, armored, mechanized thing that they have that they can add to a NATO coalition somewhere. So the Army has about 8 to 10,000 active duty, and these guys are really kitted out. They're not the brigades. It's got 2 brigades. They're not really meant to deploy. The idea is for the 2 brigades to generate battle groups as required by pulling together elements from the different kinds of units, the regiments that form a part of these brigades. They also have a 150-strong special operations unit known as the Jaeger Corps and a specialized Arctic unit that operates in Greenland. These things are called the Sirius, like the star, Dog Sled Patrol. These guys are like Paw Patrol on steroids. The Danes classify the Sirius Patrol as among their elite special forces, so that makes them different from the Canadian Rangers, which are more like a paramilitary or even a militia. I think they're special not because they've got like super awesome weapon skills, but because of the training and the physical capabilities and just sort of the skill set. There aren't many of them. I've read that there are only actually 12 of them, and they go out in 6 2-man sled teams. They deploy to Greenland for 2-year tours, and during those 2 years they go out on several multi-month missions. Yes, they are armed. Interestingly, they are armed with World War I vintage American M1917 Enfield rifles chambered in 1306, and they have Glock 20s, which are Glock pistols but chambered for 10mm bullets. They also carry armored piercing and hollow point rounds, which otherwise I believe are illegal, to be able to take down polar bears, and I read musk oxen that apparently get really irate and start attacking people. Apparently that's a thing. So let's get back to the main units. Like, what do they have? They have 44 main battle tanks. These are Leopard 2 A7s. They have 44 infantry fighting vehicles, CV-90s, 399 armored personnel carriers, Movac Piranhas, and M113s, 8 Israeli MLRS systems. These are the PULS or PULS system, 19 Israeli self-propelled Atmos howitzers, which the Danes picked up as to replace the 19 French-made Caesar howitzers that they donated to Ukraine in 2023. They've ordered a lot of stuff: 159 CV-90s, 130 Patria 6x6 APCs, and 16 Skyranger 30s. These are basically new air defense things that everybody's really interested in because of drones. Now let's get to the Homeguard before I leave the Army topic. I think this is very interesting. There are about 13,000, I read there are 44 to 51,000 people in the Homeguard from according to two different sources I read. Of whom 13,000 are on active duty and the rest are reservists. This is a volunteer civil defense force that was founded by members of the Danish resistance in 1945. And from what I read, the always implied but never actually said out loud mission of the Homeguard was to resist a Soviet invasion. It's organized by region and is by and large light infantry. There is a naval Homeguard that operates a fairly large fleet of small patrol vessels that patrol, and do search and rescue. Next, let's talk about the Royal Danish Air Force. Denmark, after World War II, has fairly consistently maintained a large air force, proportionately large, mostly about American fighter jets, with the exception of Saab Drakens and the Hawker Hunter. In the 1990s, they went heavily into the F-16s, and at some point they had 77 of them. Danish F-16 saw action in the Balkans and in Libya. They were not involved in Afghanistan, but they did go into Iraq in 2014, 2016 to participate in the anti-ISIS coalition campaign. The F-16 force has been shrinking. They only have, I believe, 36 F-16s. They just sold a bunch to Argentina, of all people, and they are replacing the F-16s with the F-35A. They have 21 already, and they've ordered a total of 43 F-35s. They also have a whole bunch of transport aircraft like C-130Js, a bunch of helicopters, American stuff and European stuff. They've ordered 4 MQ-9 Reapers. Denmark does not have its own tanker aircraft, but instead participates in the pooled NATO fleet. I wonder if that's a good idea these days, like being part of a NATO thing when the U.S. seems to be sabotaging NATO. I don't know. Anyways, they have patrol aircraft. These are maritime patrol aircraft, Challenger 604s, and they just ordered 3 new American Boeing P-8 maritime patrol aircraft. Just a quick note about Danish air defenses. Right now, like everybody else in basically NATO and Western Europe, after the end of the Cold War, they disinvested from air defenses because you don't need them. Now, belatedly, they're reinvesting in air defenses. So they have the Norwegian, the NASAM system, and they have placed orders for 3 Iris-T SLM air defense systems. Those are Germans. 2 VL Mica air defense systems and 2 SAMP-T air defense system, which apparently is a land-based version of the Aster 30. Finally, we get to the Royal Danish Navy, which I think is probably the more important of these military branches. Just a little history here, because I think this is interesting. During the Cold War, the Navy had something like a Jeune Ecole approach. This made sense. It's a defensive Navy designed to protect Denmark's coast and deny the Soviets access to the Danish Straits. That's the priority. So you have a lot of small missile and torpedo boats, mine warfare boats, both mine layers and mine hunters, and submarines adept at shallow water operations, which would work in tandem with naval special operations. They also had land-based coastal anti-ship rocket artillery. These are truck-mounted Harpoon missiles. They did have larger surface combatants, but relatively speaking, not many. So, for instance, in the 1980s, the Royal Danish Navy had 2 frigates and 3 corvettes and a whole bunch of fast attack missile boats, torpedo boats, mine layers, and 5 diesel electric subs. When the Cold War ended, the Danish Navy, like other Western European navies, restructured itself. So instead of going from having the defensive Jeune Ecole-esque defensive posture with the smaller vessels that implies, Denmark opted for a smaller number of larger multi-mission blue water vessels designed to participate in multinational expeditionary operations. The concrete expression of this came in the form of 2 classes of large surface combatants. These are frigates, really, the Absalon class and the Iver Huitfeldt. I have no idea how to pronounce it. I'm really sorry. My apologies to the Danes. I do not know how to pronounce your language. Thank God all of you are insanely fluent in English. So getting around Denmark when I was there like 2 years ago was super easy. The Absalon class, of which there are 2, both commissioned in 2005, is a very interesting vessel. It's designed to be like a Swiss Army knife. It's got some of the capabilities of a modern frigate, plus some of the capabilities of a modern amphibious assault ship or transport ship. So it's got frigate-like firepower, but with a very large internal flight deck and a ramp in the stern for vehicles. And depending on the mission, you can also tailor it. You can make it more of a frigate, meaning more weapons, firepower, or more of a transport or even a hospital ship. Then you have the 3 Iver Huitfeldt class frigates. These things are tailored for air defense. They were commissioned in 2012 and 2013, so these things are newish. They have some anti-submarine warfare capabilities, but and they operate helicopters that are really kitted out for that purpose. Unfortunately, I can't mention this class of frigate without bringing up what happened to them in 2024. In March 2024, I believe it's actually the Iver Huitfeldt, right, was serving in the Red Sea as part of a NATO effort to deal with Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. The frigate engaged with, there was the swarm, I think like 12 Houthi drones or something like that, and managed to shoot some down, great. But then suddenly there was a glitch, and several of the key air defense systems crashed or malfunctioned. And the ship was out of action for 30 minutes while the crew rebooted the system. So what happened? Well, the Danes ended up pulling the ship out of the Red Sea and having to stay out of this whole NATO mission. And they've been working for over a year now trying to fix the problems, which apparently is a very difficult thing to do, which speaks to not necessarily any failure about this frigate, but the fact that with modern warships, it's all about the integration of several very complex computerized systems. So this is a massive software headache, and just, it's very hard. It's the same thing with fighter planes, really. It's all about the technological integration of all of these technologies. It's very hard to do. The Danes are kind of in a bad place here because they had spent a lot of money on these frigates, and they also, apparently these frigates are due for modernization anyways. So now apparently the Danish Navy is thinking about not bothering to modernize them and basically just abandoning the whole class and just pushing ahead with plans to replace them. I mean, there were plans in work to replace them anyways because that's what navies do. So now they're like, maybe we shouldn't bother trying to fix these things and just push on for the new vessels. It's a real problem. I want to add that they also have 13 patrol ships of various classes and sizes, including 3 Knud Rasmussen vessels commissioned in 2008. They've got 4 Thetis class vessels commissioned in the early 1990s, which have reinforced hulls for ice. One thing I want to point out about the Danish Navy, which I think is very interesting, is that all of the larger Danish vessels have what's called the StanFlex modular mission payload system. This is sort of like a containerized system that allows a Navy to slot into a slot, like a container that has a specific set of stuff to give it a special capability. So you can add an anti-submarine warfare module to the ship, and look, you've got anti-submarine warfare capabilities, or an air defense module, or an anti-surface warfare module, or a SIGINT collection module, or maybe just a gun, maybe just a big crane, or a mine warfare module. You get the idea. And the idea is to enhance the flexibility of the entire fleet by making your vessels tailorable. And this is really important because with these vessels, mostly, I mean, you do have larger multi-mission vessels, but generally speaking, with the smaller vessels, the smaller frigates, you have to pick a vocation that this vessel has. It can do a bunch of things, but ultimately this is an air defense frigate or an anti-submarine warfare frigate, et cetera, et cetera. This gives you much more room to play with because you can tailor it by taking out the modules and putting in different modules, and you can change it up. I read that supposedly it takes a half hour to swap out a module and then a few hours to get it all ready to go because everything has to be kind of connected and everything and checked. The Upsilon class has 5 slots for StanFlex modules. The Iver Huitfeldt has 6 slots for StanFlex modules. And then the smaller patrol vessels also have 1 slot each. So the Thetis and the Knud Rasmussen. And this is really interesting because it means that you don't, patrol vessels of that kind in many navies don't actually have any kind of serious armament on them. They often might just have like a 50 caliber machine gun. But this gives you the option. You can slot in a real anti-sub warfare thing, an anti-ship capability or something like that by pulling these slots out. It's a great system. There is one more development that I do need to mention before I leave the subject of the Navy, which is as part of their shift away from sea denial and defense in the 2000s to expeditionary operations, was that the Danes decided in 2004 to decommission its submarine fleet. It made plenty of sense at the time. The submarines are expensive to own and operate, And Denmark wanted to free up money to fund its new frigates and other capabilities, which is also why it's so frustrating that 3 of their most expensive warships, these frigates that have glitchy air defense systems, like that's what they got for the money. Anyways, the net result is a relatively large and respectable size, notwithstanding the glitches in the 3 frigates, perhaps to be faulted only for its lack of submarines. But this brings us to part 5, Greenland and its implications. Now, maybe about a year ago, I would have said that the Danes needed to go back to territorial defense in the Jeune Ecole with a focus of keeping the Russians out of the Danish Straits and maybe being able and doing sea denial in the Baltics. And, let's bring back some submarines. Let's focus on the smaller vessels and the coastal artillery and that kind of thing, rather than these large multi-mission things which were conceived for a post-Cold War expeditionary coalition warfare thing that no longer seems very relevant. So more subs, more patrol craft, F-35, sure. But tanks, do you need these big brigades? Not so sure. These big multi-mission frigates, like the 2 that are supposed to have like the amphibious assault capabilities, are those useful anymore? I'm not really sure. However, here we are in January 2026, and in all honesty, it looks like the most immediate threat to Denmark is the United States. So what does that mean? It means that Denmark can't quite go back to its Cold War model because it has to be able to do the definition of territorial defense, I think, is expanded because now it's about also being able to project more force than it used to need to do into Greenland and the Arctic. And this all reminds me a bit about the situation in 1940. 1940, Denmark looked like it was a low-hanging fruit, and the Germans figured they should pluck this fruit before anybody else did. It looks like the Americans are thinking the same kind of thing about Greenland, or at least Donald Trump. Here's a low-hanging fruit, and somebody's going to pluck it, so we're going to pluck it first. And you don't want this. This is bad for Denmark, which means they need to not be a low-hanging fruit. So what does this mean, though, concretely? What on earth should the Danes do about this? Here's the thing. It's really hard to know what's driving Trump's bizarre obsession with Greenland. I mean, what is this really about? Because it might not be about anything rational or anything anything to do with what Denmark does or does not do. I mean, one can argue that maybe Trump is earnestly concerned about this idea that maybe the Russians and the Chinese are going to pick this low-hanging fruit, so the U.S. has to do it first, and maybe this is a way of expressing discontent with the extent to which Denmark and the rest of Europe have been negligent with regard to Arctic defense, although all of them have been trying to take it more seriously and they're spending more money. It is true that, militarily speaking, the Danes have a very, very thin military posture in the Arctic and in Greenland, having largely handed the defense of Greenland to the United States in 1941. But why should it, given the U.S. military presence there? I mean, if that was the deal, if the Americans were like, oh, we'll take care of defense of Greenland, then the Danes are like, okay, great. So we'll focus on these other things. It makes sense, right? Also, as far as I know, Trump has never asked the Danes to increase their military presence, nor has he taken steps to increase the American military presence. It's very interesting. The Danes could obviously increase their military posture, but so could the Americans, because by the nature of the U.S.-Danish defense agreements, if the United States want to, it could increase its military presence. It could open up more bases, send more people, send more ships. The U.S. during the Cold War had maybe half a dozen bases in Greenland. It was very active. And then after the Cold War, the U.S. slowly reduced its footprint and the number of American military personnel on Greenland. At the moment, there's only one American base on Greenland, and there are only like 450 people there, or something like that. But so Trump has not done anything about that. Like, that's the thing. It's like suddenly we're saying, oh, guys, this is terrible. Greenland is this vulnerable thing, and the Russians and the Chinese are going to grab it. We need to do more to secure it. And you know what? The Danes aren't doing it, so we're going to do it. But we've never said to the Danes, you need to do it. It's not like we've asked the Danes to do it and the Danes said, no, we don't want to. Or it's not like we've said, hey, we're going to increase our military posture in Greenland, and the Danes said no. Because The Danes haven't said no. And guess what? We haven't done it. So it's not like we've been sending more troops and expanding our bases and expanding the American military presence. We haven't done a thing. So what's this all about? Is this really about the threat of the Russians and the Chinese? And if it is, if he cared that much, then why haven't we just been increasing our military presence, which we've been able to do all along, according to the defense agreements that we currently have with Denmark? Or why haven't we been asking the Danes to expand their military presence, or NATO too? Because it's a NATO thing. You can get more NATO people there. It's not a problem. And there's certainly absolutely no reason fundamentally to break our defense agreement with the Danes. It's been going on since 1941, whereby we recognize that this is a sovereign part of the Kingdom of Denmark. This complicates life for the Danish military, for Danish military policy, because by and large, like historically, the focus is really on the Danish Straits and being a gateway between the North Sea and the Baltic, and thinking about sea denial in the Baltics. And there are also things you could do about that. But now no, it's like now it's almost like Denmark has to think about two fronts rather than one front, which makes things very difficult for a small country that has, I mean, it's a rich country, but it's only got 6 million people in it. 6 million people, that's roughly the size of the city of Atlanta's metropolitan area. It's not a lot of people. So what do you do? If I were Denmark, my advice to the Danes, you all listening, and I'm sure a lot of Danes are listening to this, I would say stop screwing around, and you just need to start putting real hardware in Greenland. You need to put your F-35s there, or some of your F-35s there. You need to get your frigates up there as quickly as you can, as often as you can. I don't know what to tell you about these frigates with the air defense systems that are all faulty. I hope you're fixing them. I hope they can be fixed, but maybe it doesn't even matter. Just put them up there. Build bases. I don't believe there's actually a naval base anymore in Greenland. Maybe it's time to reopen a naval base in Greenland. I would also propose reaching out to your fellow Scandinavians more and more for military and political support. And also what I suggest doing is the Iceland model. So Iceland, because Iceland does not have its own military, it's interesting. I mean, Iceland doesn't have its military, so the Icelandic people are their own freeloaders. And Trump's not talking about annexing Iceland. That's interesting. But anyway, there is a NATO, and it's either NATO or European Union. I think it's a NATO air police mission in Iceland. And what this means is that a few fighter jets from different NATO countries go through Iceland on a rotational basis. So it could be like 3 Italian Eurofighters or some British planes or this or that. And they do air patrolling so that there's a NATO air defense presence over the skies of Iceland, and it works out really well. And this is a really great way of ramping up the NATO sort of surveillance and defense posture in this vital strategic area. It seems to me that Greenland really needs to have this, and this would be a good thing to do. You either do it through NATO, or if NATO's a problem, you just do it on your own with your friends. And Denmark does have friends. Now, the beauty of this is that it could really ultimately be about deterring the Americans. But you never, ever have to say it. In fact, I suggest that you don't. This is just make this all about, this is for the Russians. This is for the Chinese. And the idea is to demonstrate to Trump that Denmark and other European allies are serious about the Arctic and serious about Arctic security and serious about Greenland security. So just do it. The catch, though, the caveat here is that I can't really say with certainty that's really what this is all about anyways. Like, is Trump really worried about the security of Greenland? In which case, he might look at some sort of air policing thing and say, oh, this is great. Thank you, guys. Perfect. This is what I wanted. We're good to go. Great. Oh, you're basing a new frigate there. That's awesome. Oh, you're building a new base and you're putting your, 10 F-35s there. That's awesome. Is that really what it's all about? And I'm not entirely sure that it is, because I feel like a lot of this might just be some strange ego thing, some strange way of making history, or Trump's all about branding and slapping his name on stuff. Is that what this is about? Or is this some weird business thing where he's just going to try to grab in Greenland some mineral deals that are going to enrich some of his oligarch friends? Is that what's going on? It's really hard to say, because there is the rhetoric, although the rhetoric's all over the place. And it's never really clear that any of the rhetoric is true. Anyways, is there a threat? Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, yeah, I'm horrified to say it, but I think that Danes really should be worried about this. And the problem is the context. The problem is that Trump, in light of Venezuela and grabbing Maduro, and in light of this business about blowing up the ships in the Gulf of Mexico, and there's this piratical aspect to the Trump administration that is really worrisome. Add to that the strange Don Rowe doctrine, like this whole thing about the Western Hemisphere. And I could see, like, on social media, a lot of the Trumpists are like, yeah, man, the Western Hemisphere, yeah, we should kick all the Europeans out or something like that. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. It makes no sense whatsoever, but it's there, and I can't deny it. And I've seen people say, like on social media, oh, Michael, you're overreacting. There won't be any military threat against Greenland or Denmark. This is just some like a bargaining or negotiating tactic. This is all, like, doesn't really mean anything. It's just we're going to make a deal. We're going to buy it. Okay, fine. But buying it in the present context is ultimately coercion because of the implied, if not explicitly stated, military threat. In the present context, there is a military threat, even if it's not explicit, because of Venezuela, because of a lot of the things that the Trump administration has been doing. So I don't think the United States can in good faith say, oh, we're not threatening Denmark, we're not threatening Greenland, we're just going to offer to buy it. Because guess what? The Danes have already said no. The Greenlanders, from what we understand, have already said no. So what are we going to do about it? It looks like this. I mean, this is it. Like, people have been asking me ever since I started my Pax Americana channel, is the Pax Americana still exist? And I'm not so sure, or rather, it's changing. The face of it is changing. The nature of the Pax America is changing a lot, or at risk of changing a lot, and then it's changing into something that I certainly don't particularly like or endorse. And I also don't even think it's in America's interest to have this new 19th century piratical predatory Pax Americana versus the liberal empire that we put into place in 1945. It's not just more satisfying because it's liberal and more moral, whatever, we could feel good about it. No, I actually think it's more in America's interest and makes us stronger than this piratical, go it alone, to hell with the rest of the world approach that we seem to be going about now. Anyways, I've digressed from the question of Denmark. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it interesting. Thank you. If you look in my description, you're going to see links to my social media, X, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, my own website, michaelsherkin.com, plus my Substack, which is also called Pax Americana. Thank you, and stay tuned. There's plenty more in the pipeline. Bye-bye.